Hello, my name is Dr. John Brungardt. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Newman University, and today I'm going to talk with you about Natural Philosophy, an Introduction, an article that you can find at ect.org. In this presentation about the philosophy of nature, we'll cover defining the philosophy of nature, the principles of change, followed by nature and causality, as well as investigating the cosmos full of motion. We'll then turn to ultimates in natural philosophy and consider the philosophy of nature as wisdom before a brief conclusion. So what is the philosophy of nature? The philosophy of nature is the part of philosophy that studies the physical cosmos. A bit more precisely, the philosophy of nature is the science of mobile being. It was founded by Aristotle and continued throughout history, including great figures like St. Albert the Great, and it includes St. Thomas Aquinas. The phrase philosophy of nature or physics you can also find in other historical figures, like the Epicureans or the Stoics. Even people who we would think of as scientists, like Isaac Newton or Robert Boyle, were originally called natural philosophers before anyone thought to call them scientists. The word scientist is actually a word invented in the 19th century. So you might wonder, if the philosophy of nature has such an ancient and venerable lineage, why don't we talk about it today? It's true that currently we would usually use the phrase natural science or the sciences to describe what natural philosophy started. In fact, our contemporaries would most likely raise the objection that we shouldn't study natural philosophy, that natural philosophy was born, it got its feet under it, so to speak, in a time when the sciences were at its infancy. Anything that would be valuable about natural philosophy today would pale in comparison to what the sciences could provide. Natural philosophy itself was based upon unsound and now outdated concepts. Like many good objections, there's a lot of truth to that. There's quite a bit, in fact, if you look at natural philosophy historically, that we can recognize is no longer true. But what you should think about, at least at the beginning here, is that the philosophy of nature contains and builds upon perennial principles that are true and are required to start scientific inquiry about the cosmos. And it's those principles that we hold on to in the philosophy of nature. The straightforward way to talk about the subject of natural philosophy is to ask, well, what does it talk about? The subject of a part of philosophy or a science, as Aristotle would say, the subject is that about which there is speech in a given topic. The subject of natural philosophy is mobile being. Motion, the reality of motion, it's all around us. And the striking character of motion, why things move as they do, why they behave as they do, whether it's yourself or a dog or a plant, that reality of motion draws the mind, it attracts us to ask, why is this happening? So we take the reality of motion as an effect and name the subject of natural philosophy from it, that it's mobile or changing being. There are a couple other approaches. You might think, for instance, that the subject of natural philosophy is something empirical, an empirical or sensible being. This isn't far from the truth, but to talk about the subject of natural philosophy as empirical or sensible, in that way we're really naming how we know something instead of what we're knowing. You might also think that the philosophy of nature studies material being. Many of the natural sciences might describe themselves that way, that they're studying some aspect or other of material being. This is also not far from the truth. The philosophy of nature, in point of fact, studies material being. That's not quite the best way to describe its subject, however. The reason for that is when you call something a material being, that can be rather equivocal. Different philosophers would define matter differently. And so when you define the philosophy of nature as having to do with material being, you're papering over those disagreements with a kind of equivocation. You might consider that both a Catholic theologian and a Protestant theologian and even an atheist could define theology as about divine things, but they would give very different meanings to that phrase. A third way that you might define the philosophy of nature is that it's about physical or natural things. This is also plausible, but a difficulty with this is that to call something a physical or a natural being is really naming the thing or the thing under study by one of its causes. By contrast, if we talk about the subject of natural philosophy as mobile being, we're really including the whole ambit, the entirety of what we want to talk about. A comparison might be that a criminologist would study more than just criminals. It would also be crime or patterns of crime or things like that. The more adequate way to talk about the subject of the philosophy of nature is to say that it's about mobile being. This is what St. Thomas recommends to us. In this, St. Thomas is even disagreeing with St. Albert the Great, who said that the subject of natural philosophy is mobile body. But what St. Thomas points out is that's actually too specific. There are other things that the philosophy of nature studies apart from bodies. Where should we begin the study of natural philosophy? Well, one might naturally think to begin with Aristotle. Aristotle recommends, and in fact discovered, the proper way to begin natural philosophy. And in that, he recommends two parts. The first part is by way of sensation. So here you might think of Aristotle's doctrine articulating induction, that it's based upon a variety of experience that we draw or abstract or have insight into various concepts that later on become useful in the philosophy of nature. One might also think of Aristotle himself beginning this way, say in the History of Animals or the Parts of Animals, reporting his experience studying fish or birds or other creepy crawly things on the island of Lesbos in the Mediterranean. The reason, though, we need not only begin the philosophy of nature by way of sensation, but also by way of a kind of intellectual insight, is that you could sense something but not really understand it. You could see that the sky is dark at night but not know why. You could observe water expanding when it freezes but not know why. So apart from the way of sensation, we also need to start natural philosophy or begin natural philosophy by way of an intellectual understanding. In this path, what Aristotle points out is that our minds first begin in a vague and general grasp of things. So an example he gives to illustrate this is, at first, you wouldn't intellectually be able to distinguish between a circle and an oval. Looking at them, you would be able to distinguish them, but the visual or the sensible aspect of those two distinct objects are not the intelligible difference between them. The intelligible difference between them is that they have distinct definitions. So at first, your mind wouldn't be able to distinguish them clearly, but after you investigated, or perhaps after a teacher pointed out the difference between the two, you'd intellectually grasp why they're different. Another illustration that Aristotle uses is from children. He points out that children at first call all men fathers or all women mothers. So the point of the example here is that a child can correctly pick out that this adult or that adult has children, but the child can't yet distinguish that, in point of fact, some adult men are not fathers yet, or some adult women are not mothers yet. So there's in the example there's a mix of vagueness, correctness, and therefore certitude, but also an error that the child hasn't clarified yet. Progress in natural philosophy is a lot like this. It's a lot like children. We're a lot like children slowly calling natural things by their proper names. We will start with a vaguer or more confused notion of something, and slowly we'll clarify it. We'll make distinctions and become more definite and specific about what we're trying to know. To briefly recap, the goal of natural philosophy is to understand the principles and causes of mobile being, and the way or the method that we do that is to approach the study of nature both experientially through sensation and intellectually by reasoning about it. So at this point, it might help to clarify that goal and the method, and then compare and contrast it with the natural sciences. So when we say that the goal of the philosophy of nature is to understand mobile being through its principles and causes, what we mean by a principle is something rather basic. It's where something starts off, where a motion begins. It can even mean the cause of a motion or the agent cause of emotion, but principle is a broader term. Cause, in distinction from a principle, a cause is responsible for the being or the change of a thing, whereas a principle, for instance, might just be where something starts. So you could think of a line that where you start drawing a line is its principle, but that point is not the same as the agent cause. You're the agent cause of drawing the line. So the philosophy of nature looks into, it investigates, it tries to discover these principles and causes of mobile things, of natural things. So we should clarify a few points about the method of natural philosophy as well. The first of these we should call the order of determination. The second is the order of demonstration. If you don't keep these distinct, most likely you'll end up with an erroneous conception about what the philosophy of nature does. So the order of determination follows that natural path of the mind that we were speaking about earlier, that we begin with what's more knowable to us at first, and then we proceed towards what's more intelligible by nature. So that entails that we go from thoughts that are very general, at first vague and confused, and slowly we make distinctions and become more specific. So that's the order of determination. It's based upon drawing from experience, and over time, we are slowly able to emerge from this general conception of things to approach a more specific conception of things. A brief example of this might be that at first, we thought water was an element. Only later on did we distinguish elements within water and even further parts within the elements that constitute water. The second order is the order of demonstration. Here, in the order of demonstration, the philosopher of nature is trying to link causes and effects. So in contrast to the order of determination, which is a bit more conceptual, you're investigating things and arraying and arranging the resources, the conceptual resources of the philosophy of nature. In the order of demonstration, you start to link all of those resources. You sort out effects and investigate their cause. You clarify the cause of something, and you see the effects in light of that cause. A brief example here would be that you go out at night, and all of a sudden you see the moon going dark. It was a full moon, but now it's there's a shadow on it. It's turning red, and in fact it turns black and disappears. And you're wondering what in the world is going on. That's an effect, and unless you're aware of what a lunar eclipse is, you might at first have literally no idea about what's going on. So the order of demonstration takes those observations and those effects and searches for, well, what was the cause of the moon going dark? Perhaps you realize, like the ancient Greek pre-Socratics did, that, well, the full moon is opposite to the sun in the night sky, and the earth is in between them. So a lunar eclipse, this darkening of the moon, is the shadow of the earth being cast upon the moon. So when you attain that insight, you're really linking a cause to its effect. The reason that we should keep the order of demonstration and the order of determination distinct is that the philosophy of nature does not make headway. It does not progress by a kind of conceptual, a prioristic guessing or deduction. So you don't start with very general notions and then deduce conclusions from those. You have to, along the order of determination, really investigate what it is that you want to know, and then only later can you reason through and hopefully arrive at an argument or a demonstration about the truth of whatever it is you're asking about. So apart from the goals and methods of the philosophy of nature, Aristotle and St. Thomas also articulate various parts of the philosophy of nature. Most fundamentally, they talk about the parts of the philosophy of nature in terms of the different kinds of motion. So the classic Aristotelian senses of motion are first local motion, so a thing moving from one place to another. The second type is alteration, so a change in quality. So for example, water heating up from cold to hot. The third type of motion is growth. This is not, simply speaking, an accretion of parts, but it's really something proper to living things. So a child growing from a toddler to a teenager to an adult. The last kind of change is more extreme than those. It's substantial change. So when one kind of thing ceases to be and another kind of thing comes into being. So the classic example of this would, of course, be conception or death. So the philosophy of nature is articulated into parts based upon those different kinds of motion. So the study of local motion would most closely correspond to what we today call physics. The study of alteration would most closely correspond to chemistry, and the study of growth and other related changes associated with growth would correspond most closely to biology. So at this point, you might wonder, isn't the philosophy of nature just a general and vague way to talk about the natural sciences? And there's something to that in the course of its history, the philosophy of nature did develop into the various natural sciences. But there's a piece that's missing if we speak about it in just that sense. The part that's missing is the study or the articulation of motion in general. So not in any of those specific forms, but just to talk about motion and its causes in general terms. The reason that the philosophy of nature can do this is precisely because it begins with a common experience of motion or mobile things. By common experience, what I mean is the experience of the natural order that's commonly available to anyone, unavoidable when you experience natural things, and implicit at a very proximate level in anything that you experience. So it's hard to avoid, in fact, I think impossible, it's hard to avoid in your experience of the natural world that motion takes time. The philosophy of nature begins with and clarifies and develops these sorts of experiences. The natural sciences, by contrast, they begin with a technical experience of things, a more proximate or proper experience. This kind of experience not everyone has, so it's not common. It is, in fact, avoidable unless you're running experiments. You're probably not going to come across it. And the technique involved in observation or experimentation it's not necessarily explicit in your ordinary experience of the natural order. So in that sense, even though the natural sciences do carry on what the philosophy of nature begins, there's a sense of natural philosophy that relies on this general experience of nature. And it's that sense that we are going to keep talking about. And later we can circle back to compare and contrast natural philosophy and the natural sciences again. So having defined the subject and the goal and the method of the philosophy of nature, where should we go next? Here we should think of, again, the goal is to know moving things. So we could start by defining motion. Motion has various causes. Perhaps we should start by looking at the various causes. In fact, Aristotle does do this. He'll define motion, he'll define the causes, and he'll define nature as a cause. But even before those two subjects, there's a fundamental problem or difficulty that we have to tackle first, and that's whether motion or change is intelligible at all. So that's why we have to begin by really discovering the principles of change. So what is the problem of change? The problem of change is, naturally speaking, the first difficulty that the philosopher of nature should encounter. Both Parmenides and Heraclitus, the ancient Greek philosophers, pointed out this problem in different ways. So on the one hand, Parmenides, you might recall, says that being is one and immobile. Parmenides looks at motion and he sees something unintelligible. In order for something to change, it seems like it will either have to cease being what it is, or it will have to start existing or come into being when before it was not. So you might think of, well, look, there's this dog right here. Where did it come from? So, well, did it always exist? That seems implausible. Or on the other hand, at some point, did it not exist and then it comes into being? Parmenides would stop you right there and say, well, if at some point it did not exist and then it comes into being, what you're really saying is some nothing or some non-being is changing into a being, which seems impossible. What can come from nothing? On the other hand, Heraclitus argues that everything is in motion. There is, in fact, nothing stable or unchanging. Here, you might think of his famous line that you can't step in the same river twice. The flow of time carries along everything with it. Even if something looks permanent, it's really just changing very slowly. Why do these two objections make change unintelligible? The first reason, on the side of Parmenides, is that Parmenides is emphasizing too much what the intellect brings to our understanding of change. He's emphasizing things like the principle of non-contradiction, that something can't both be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. He's emphasizing something like the principle of identity, that in order for something to exist, it has to remain the same as it is. On the other hand, Heraclitus is emphasizing too much our sensible experience of changing things. We see that or hear that or feel that things are mutable, and it appears to us that nothing is fixed. Other Greek philosophers like Empedocles or Democritus, they received these two objections from Parmenides and Heraclitus, and they tried to split the difference. So for instance, these ancient Greek materialists, they posited principles that, to satisfy Parmenides, didn't change, but to try to satisfy Heraclitus also changed. So for instance, Empedocles posits that there are four elements or roots underlying everything, earth, air, fire, and water. So those were unchanging to satisfy Parmenides, while they could combine in various ratios or proportions, and then to us, to our sensible appearances, they would change, and this might satisfy Heraclitus. Democritus does something similar with atoms. The unchanging elements, the unchanging principles for Democritus are the atoms and the void, and that satisfies Parmenides. Whereas to our appearances, the atoms shift and recombine, and we experience things changing. The difficulty with these solutions is that they pit our sense experience against our intellectual understanding of things. We end up with a type of dualism that we can't reconcile what we sensibly experience about the natural world with what we hope to intellectually grasp about the natural world. Someone like Democritus or Empedocles recognized this. Democritus says, because of this dualism, he says that truth is in the depths. We can't really and sensibly access it. Empedocles even mocks those who describe things, who describe the appearances as if they are real, that our names for things don't reach to the heart of reality. In order to solve the problem of change posed by Parmenides and Heraclitus, what we need is a coordinated set of distinctions. So first, we should consider that when Parmenides is talking about being, you could talk about being, or for that matter, non-being, in an unqualified or a qualified sense. So to go back to the example of the dog that comes into existence, that's the dog existing now. It exists in an unqualified sense. What do we mean by that? So a qualified sense of being would be, for example, where is the dog right now? Or what color is its fur? There, you're talking about ways in which the dog exists, whether in a place or a certain characteristic that it has, that in point of fact qualifies what already exists in a more fundamental sense, namely the dog. So Parmenides doesn't distinguish between these two senses of being, an unqualified versus a qualified sense of being. Neither does he distinguish between an unqualified sense of non-being and a qualified sense of non-being. So a qualified sense of non-being would be something like an absence or a privation. So, for example, if one of your shirts is missing a button, you might say, there's no button right there. So you're indicating a kind of non-existence, but it's qualified in the sense that there are in fact existing things, and you contrast those with what ought to be there or what's absent. Whereas an unqualified sense of non-being is nothingness. So Parmenides is not distinguishing that when we say that something like a dog comes into existence, it's not coming into existence from utter non-being or unqualified non-being. There's something that exists beforehand that's qualifiedly not what's going to exist later. What exists beforehand? This is what Aristotle or St. Thomas call potency. What exists beforehand is some potential being that has the capacity or inclination, the aptitude to become, in this case, a dog. That qualified sense of being, of potency, is really what Parmenides is missing. Heraclitus, on the other hand, is also misunderstanding this distinction between act and potency. Act is a principle of stability or permanence. Because the dog retains its characteristic canine nature, something we'll elaborate on here in a little bit, the dog is able to remain the same as a dog, even while undergoing other changes. So let's review. The solution to the problem of change is this coordinated set of distinctions between potency, act, and privation. Those are the three principles of change. Potency is a type of capacity or ability. Act is the principle by which something is or currently exists. And privation is that lack or absence. Now, potency, act, and privation can become technical terms or a kind of jargon. How we avoid that is we just remember we're really trying to describe and articulate our common experience of changing things. A thing is capable of changing and receiving a new characteristic, which it currently lacks. And that's the basics of what potency, act, and privation are. These three principles of change, potency, act, and privation, we find in different kinds of change in different ways. So, for example, there's the qualified kind of change or accidental change. In this case, you have something like a person or a dog or a cat that's undergoing some sort of change, but it remains what it is. The dog remains a dog or the cat remains a cat. So this sort of accidental change, the potency involved is the subject, the dog or the cat, whereas the act, in this case, it's an accidental form. The dog acquires a new location, or the cat grows, for instance. The more extreme form of change is substantial change. In this case, the subject of the change becomes a different kind of thing. So, for example, the cat dies, or a dog is conceived and comes into existence. You destroy water via electrolysis, or you constitute water via reverse electrolysis. These more extreme forms of change, you still have potency or act present. In this case, though, the potency is a substantial potency or matter, whereas the act is a substantial form. One important thing to notice and to think about is that form and matter, or the act and potency of a substance like a person or a dog or an oak tree, these principles are not only principles of change, but they're also principles of being. So when the oak tree comes into existence, or when the dog comes into existence, its form and matter are co-causes and present currently at the same time throughout the existence of that thing. So form and matter are not only principles of change, but they're also principles of being. It's by realizing this that we really first begin to distinguish that to exist or being is not quite the same thing as to move or moving. In this way, the philosophy of nature really assists us in beginning a speculative philosophical inquiry into things. We should also think that these three principles of change, as fundamental as they are, they don't tell the whole story about what's going on in the natural world. A thing can't bring itself into existence, right? So form and matter we can use to explain what a thing is or how it changes, but we still need a further cause, what Aristotle or St. Thomas will call the agent cause or the efficient cause, that brings it into existence. That agent also usually has a goal, and so we'll need to talk about the final cause. So what are the importance of the principles of change? The principles of change not only refer to principles in the real order of things, they're also principles of our own further inquiry. What I mean by that is by realizing that things change because of potency and act, and this involves privation, that simply raises further questions. Well, in this or that case of motion or change, how do we articulate, how do we further specify potency or act? So we should illustrate the importance of the principles of change, potency, act, and privation as principles of our own inquiry with a couple of examples. Here I'd like to read a first example from Plutarch in his Life of Theseus. The ship on which Theseus sailed with the youths and returned in safety, the 30-oared galley, was preserved by the Athenians. They took away the old timbers from time to time and put new and sound ones in their places, so that the vessel became a standing illustration for the philosophers in the mooted question of growth, some declaring that it remained the same, others that it was not the same vessel. So here we see in the illustration of the ship of Theseus, the question of permanence and stability along with change. You might think also of cell turnover, right? Every so often, on the order of days or weeks, your red blood cells are entirely replaced. John Locke, in his writings, even raises this question about the identity of a person over time. So we're not going to solve this right now. This is simply an illustration of, well, how is potency involved or act involved in accounting for or explaining, is the ship of Theseus the same ship over time, or at some point, no, it's entirely a new ship. Another illustration of where these principles can lead, as long as we further articulate them, is one of Zeno's paradoxes. Aristotle writes, "There is no motion because that which is moving must reach the midpoint before the end. It is always necessary to traverse half the distance, but these are infinite, and it is impossible to get through things that are infinite." So the paradox here, the apparent paradox, you could think of it as a series of fractions that first you have to go through one half of the distance, and then to reach the end, you'll have to go through 3/4 of the distance, and then 7/8, etc. But there's no end to that series, so you'll never be able to get where you're going. You could also flip it around and argue you could never start going where you want to go. Now, again, the point here is not to attempt to solve Zeno's paradox. It's to point out, well, how are act and potency involved in the paradox? Is it really true that as you go, say, from here to the door, you are actually at all of those points in between, or are you only potentially at those points in between? And the way Aristotle solves the problem is, in fact, with a distinction between act and potency. A third example of the importance of the principles of change, and there could be many more, but we'll stick with three. A third example is how even Catholic theology borrows or uses in an analogous way the principles of change like potency or act or form and matter. So, for example, Catholic sacraments are articulated in terms of the form or the matter of the sacrament. In the sacrament of the Eucharist, St. Thomas will talk about transubstantiation in comparison and contrast to more knowable and natural kinds of changes like accidental changes and substantial changes. Our next topic is nature and causality. A mobile being is what it is and behaves how it behaves in large part because of its nature. So we'll have to define what nature means, and it's important to keep in mind that understanding nature in this sense helps us in other areas. Understanding nature, by contrast, for instance, it will help us understand what's supernatural. It would help us understand what's against nature or what's violent. So what is the definition of nature? Aristotle defines nature as a principle and cause of motion or rest in that in which it is, primarily per se and not per accidens. That's a lot, but we'll take it bit by bit. It's helpful to talk about natural things in contrast to artificial things, because artificial things are a bit more knowable to us. So first, nature is a principle and cause. Now, these words we've talked about earlier, so we're really incorporating into our definition of nature the sorts of principles of change, the causes like form and matter that we've already articulated. Even artificial things, by comparison, have a kind of form and matter to them. So if you think of something like a watch, it's made of a certain set of materials, quartz, glass, silicon chips, rubber. It's arranged in a certain way so that it can really move, right? It tells time. The parts in the arrangement of the watch, though, even though a watch has an inside, its principles and causes are not in it in the way that Aristotle articulates in the definition of nature. So in the definition, the principle or cause is in a natural thing. This is not a kind of spatial interiority. A watch has spatial interiority, and we constitute that from the outside. By contrast, a natural thing, its principles, as it were, arise from within itself already without any sort of human intervention. There's a kind of spontaneity and pre-existence apart from human art that we recognize. So apart from this interiority of the nature of a thing, the nature of a thing is also, Aristotle says, primarily in it. The primarily here is opposed to something that's secondary. So, for example, if you think of the behavior of a salmon will naturally and primarily swim upstream at certain times of the year in order to mate. This is what it naturally does, and properly or uniquely so. Aristotle will just summarize that as this is what the salmon does primarily as a salmon. Secondarily, the salmon can do other things. It's heavy, and so when it jumps out of the water, it falls back into the water. But that the salmon has in common with other objects, other natural things that are heavy. So that doesn't particularly distinguish the salmon from other things. So we call that something that's secondary in the nature of the salmon. The final part of the definition is that the nature of something is in it per se and not per accidens. This Aristotle adds to exclude coincidental cases, he gives the example of a self-healing doctor. So a doctor who's doctoring himself, a doctor who's healing his own wound, he's using his own knowledge, which is a kind of interior principle, but that interior principle is not in him the way nature is, because the doctor could still be human, but could have failed to become a doctor. So it's really a kind of coincidence that the doctor is doctoring himself from an interior principle, because in point of fact, that's not something that he possesses naturally. In order to fully articulate the natures of things, we really need a kind of inquiry and explanation through all four causes. So we should consider Aristotle's famous four causes. The first and most obvious is matter. We've been talking about that a bit already. Matter is that out of which something is composed. Aristotle gives the example of bronze for a statue. We could also think of examples such as the organic constitution, the tissue and flesh of a salmon or a human being, the chlorophyll in a plant. So the material cause is part of the nature of the thing. So when we define nature as a principle and cause there, on the one hand, it does mean the matter of a thing, but we can't stop there, right? You could have all of the material of a salmon, but it could be the salmon that's you're about to purchase in order to eat it later, right? The merely having the materials of a thing doesn't quite yet make the thing. So that points us to, in addition to matter being part of the nature of the thing, we also have to include the form. What exactly is form, though? Initially, we might think of form in a more sensible or experiential way. That form is the shape or structure of an object. The form of a chair is how its materials, its seat or legs and back, are arranged or structured in a certain way. This isn't as helpful for living things, though. So we might think of the form of a living thing in terms of the harmony or arrangement of its parts and how they maintain a kind of balance while the thing is alive over time. Living things can also do things, move, eat, reproduce. So we might even think that the form of this living thing is a set of capacities or abilities or powers that it has. Now, all of these, in fact, name or describe certain forms that a natural substance has. Most of them, all of those, however, so shape and structure, arrangement, a kind of harmonious proportion of materials over time, or capacities, those are all accidental forms. The form that we properly put in the definition of nature is the substantial form of the thing. It's the underlying or the most fundamental act that roots and unifies all of those other accidental forms. So we can't see it, we can't observe it, but intellectually we realize it has to be there because, for instance, the dog or the oak tree, it exists and acts as one thing. So we're led from the use of form to describe these more accidental features to positing form as the act that unifies all of this array of changes in the dog or the oak tree or the human being. It unifies it as one thing. An important precision about this relationship between the substantial form and matter of a thing involves the dreaded term prime or primary matter. So we should talk a little bit about prime matter. What is prime matter? Prime matter is pure physical potentiality. What do we mean by that? In order for a substance to exist, a physical substance to exist, the examples we've been talking about, like a salmon or an oak tree, they have very specific kinds of matter. Say we might say that the salmon is a carbon-based life form in common with others. But we can't simply stop. The philosophy of nature doesn't simply stop at the lowest kind of matter, right? Whether it's carbon or some fundamental particle, those are still types or kinds of things, and therefore they have some sort of form. In order to fully understand the potency of the thing, Aristotle points out that we by analogy compare the form a thing has to the ability to take on that form. So in the case of a substance, we're really comparing the substance's form itself to the ability to take on that form. If that ability itself had a kind of form, a couple of untoward consequences would result. So we might then have some kind of atomist picture that really what we're talking about is the ability to take on a kind of form is inherent in these fundamental particles or atoms, and they have a substantial form. What that means, though, is then the salmon or the oak tree, it's really an accidental arrangement of things. It really doesn't have the kind of unity and coherence that we attribute to it. Now, this might not seem like a very high price to pay, but we have to remember in the order that we investigate things in the philosophy of nature, we have to begin with what's clearer and more certain to us at first. So if we begin the study of nature by denying that the salmon or ourselves have a kind of unity, we're already we're already undercutting our experience. So if the potency that's able to take on substantial form isn't itself a kind of thing already, it has to be a potency for types or kinds of things. It in fact has to be a pure potency. So that's why we say prime matter or primary matter is pure physical potency for natural things. In addition to form and matter, there are two further causes, the agent cause and the final cause. Because a thing can't bring itself into existence, we have to posit agent causes or efficient causes, the principle by which something is changed or brought into being. We can see inductively, for instance, that the agent cause is necessary. Water does not heat itself up. The dog does not generate itself. The oak tree does not generate itself. So just inductively by experience, we can see that when change occurs, there's an agent cause. Some cases might be harder. There are more philosophical arguments to prove the necessity that any change requires an agent cause, but right now we're sticking with more of the basics. An agent cause, when it's acting, has a type of intentionality. Its action has within itself a directedness, in this case to the form that it's trying to bring about. So a sculptor, for example, is trying to bring about a certain shape. That's the intentionality of his agency. Analogously, natural things, natural agents, also have this intentionality, this natural inclination towards a result. This can happen whether or not they're consciously aware of this. So we are most often consciously aware of what we're trying to do. So we have a purposeful natural intentionality. But at a deeper level, even things without knowledge, even things without cognition, have a natural inclination to an end or goal. So in the philosophy of nature, it's not improper to say that the salmon naturally intends to mate. It's not improper to say that the oak tree naturally intends to reach maturity. In the case of the oak tree, it is without awareness. In the case of the salmon, it's without an intellectual awareness of what it's doing. But in all of those cases, there's a finality, a goal state, or a good that directs the motion by way of a final cause, by being the goal of that motion. An helpful illustration, at least experientially, to see that conscious awareness is not necessary in order to have a goal or a purpose is to think of something that you can do by muscle memory. Aquinas uses the example of a guitarist. If we modernize the instrument, so a guitarist who's really capable, they don't have to pause and think about the chord that they're going to strum. It as it were, it happens naturally without reflection. Whereas a beginning guitarist, he'll have to pause and think, and there will be an interruption in the music that he's trying to play because of that conscious deliberation that's going on. It's important to talk about final causality, not only because the three other causes depend upon it, but also chance and necessity in the natural order really depend upon final causality. So let's talk about chance and necessity and that they need final causality. What is chance? Chance, it's more easily understood if we contrast it with what happens always, or for the most part, or for the lesser part, in the natural course of things. So what happens always would be something that happens by a kind of natural necessity. The cause at work can't really be impeded. A contemporary example might be gravitational force. You can't shield or mute gravitational force, whereas you can shield something from electromagnetism, for example. What happens for the most part in the course of nature, it could be impeded, or it could, due to intrinsic insufficiency, just fail. So a dog attempting to bring about other dogs, well, it could fail. The tree could be impeded in its growth. What happens for the lesser part in the natural course of things, this is something that's rare due to something, causes that are interfering with others. And it's here that we can locate what Aristotle means by chance. Chance is really an agency that's acting in an accidental way. What happens because of that is the chance event. But chance is really a kind of accidental causality. The example Aristotle uses is you bump into someone at the marketplace. You weren't intending to meet them there, but you could have. It's just by chance that the meeting was arranged. You going to the marketplace to buy cantaloupe, and your friend going to the marketplace to buy bananas, and you meet by chance. This happens in the natural order of things also. You might think of predator and prey relationships. right? The lions could intentionally hunt antelope, and so that would be an agency that happens per se, or with a kind of intentionality. Whereas, accidentally speaking, the lion might just be going to get a drink of water and happen upon an antelope, and so that at that juncture was the lion wasn't hunting, but that meeting comes about by chance. Another important aspect of final causality is that final causality is the cause of causes. St. Thomas explains this in a helpful way as follows. The end is not the cause of that which is the efficient cause, but it is the cause of the efficient cause being an efficient cause. For example, health does not cause the doctor to be a doctor. I am speaking of the health which comes about by the doctor's activity, but it causes the doctor to be an efficient cause. Therefore, the end is the cause of the causality of the efficient cause, because it causes the efficient cause to be an efficient cause. Likewise, the end causes the matter to be the matter and the form to be the form, since matter receives the form only for the sake of the end, and the form perfects the matter only through the end. Therefore, we say that the end is the cause of causes, because it is the cause of the causality of all causes. Now, there's a lot there, but we could unpack it by really looking at Aquinas' example. If the doctor is going to heal someone, that the form of health that the doctor wishes to bring about determines and causes the causality of all of the causes that the doctor uses. It makes intelligible everything that the doctor is doing and everything that he employs to bring about health. Without health as an end, for example, the doctor's own skill as a medical professional wouldn't exist. If health couldn't be brought about, there would be no corresponding art of medicine. So that's the agent cause. If health couldn't be brought about, there'd be no reason to look for certain materials, healthy food, or medicine in order to bring about health. And if health as a goal couldn't be brought about, you could never have the form of health. And there we see in a way that the final cause and the formal cause have a kind of unity, that once the goal is reached, how the goal exists is through a formal cause, in this case, health. Now, the reality of final causality, that nature acts for an end, it's received many objections and apparent difficulties over the years. The article on natural philosophy goes through many of these, but for our purposes, we could just look at one of Aristotle's arguments. One of his arguments is an analogy between art and nature. So Aristotle points out that an artistic process or a technical process, like a doctor bringing about health, goes through certain stages in order to reach an end or a goal. Analogously, natural processes go through certain stages in order to reach a goal. So here you might think of the process of gestation, a child growing in his mother's womb. The natural order of things, a stage-like progression towards a good result, a healthy baby, indicates that just like art acts for an end, so too nature acts for an end. Now, the relevant objection to this analogy is that we might be anthropomorphizing. We're really projecting our own awareness of our artistic ability, our technical skill. We're projecting that into the natural order. So it's a kind of anthropomorphization. The difficulty with this objection that's not the intention of the argument. It's misreading the intention of Aristotle's illustration. Aristotle's using art as something that's better known to us to point us to indicate how even art relies on something that's going on, that's something that's similar in nature. So to more fully refute the objection, we could even think that, well, human nature itself gives rise to art. We are artistic or technical animals. So the very ability in our arts is an unfolding of what is within human nature. So the argument, the analogy from art to nature is really leading us from what's better known into a broader domain of causality. So at this point, what has the philosophy of nature in this basic foray, what have we accomplished? We first resolved the problem of change. We argued that change or motion is itself intelligible, and it's intelligible through its principles and causes. Potency, act, privation, and causes like Aristotle's four causes. That allowed us to articulate a definition of nature in terms of the four causes. And so really all that's left now is how do we define, how do we understand the effect? How do we understand motion in itself, or in its definition? And that step really is necessary in order to make progress in natural philosophy. Aristotle points out that if you don't know what motion is, if you can't define it, then you're really not going to be able to understand the nature of something, because nature is a principle and cause of motion. The first approach to the definition of motion, Aquinas describes as in between potency and act. Consider, therefore, that something is in act only, something is in potency only, and something else is midway between potency and act. What is in potency only is not yet in motion. What is already in perfect act is no longer in motion, but has ceased to be in motion. Consequently, what is in motion is midway between pure potency and act, that is, partly in potency and partly in act, as is evident in alteration. So what St. Thomas means there, and he picks alteration as a helpful example, is think of something like boiling water. If you start boiling water, at the very beginning it's still cold, so it's still in potency to be boiling or hot, but it hasn't started to move yet. After you've brought it to a boil, the motion, the bringing to a boil, has ceased. The motion in that respect is over. So it's somewhere in between that you have the motion. So here we have to proceed with a bit of caution, because there are many points in between when the water is cold to when the water is boiling. So we might make the mistake that, well, at some point the water is lukewarm. So, yes, at some point the water is lukewarm, but that's not quite the water being heated or heating up, because we're trying to identify the motion involved and not simply the state or stage during the motion, right? If you took the pot off the stove in the middle of the process, you'd have lukewarm water, but it would no longer be in motion in that respect. So in order to understand the very motion involved in heating up, we have to anticipate, as it were, we have to anticipate where we're headed. So the water in between potency and act has something of the act of boiling, but it's still in potency to the fullness of being at a full boil. So what that means is we're thinking about motion as a kind of privation, right? The state of the middle point being lukewarm insofar as it's still deprived of the fullness of being at a boil, it's in motion. So this leads us to Aristotle's actual definition. Aristotle defines motion as the actuality of what exists in potency qua potency, which is a mouthful and at first glance probably incomprehensible. But what we should recall is we're trying to describe our ordinary experience. So the motion of being heated is an actuality. It's the actuality of what exists in potency, namely the water is potentially boiling, and the motion as the act of this potency is still in potency. There's a kind of privation there. The water is deprived of being at a boil, but the act of the motion is ordered to that full state of boiling. Another example that might help wrap your mind around Aristotle's cumbersome definition of motion as the actuality of what exists in potency as such is think of someone standing in a doorway and you are walking through the doorway. If at the moment where you're walking through the doorway and the other person is standing in the doorway, you freeze frame, as it were, ask yourself, what's the difference between the person standing in the doorway and yourself walking through the doorway? At that moment, in a sense, you are both in the doorway, but the person standing in the doorway isn't ordered in the here and now. They're not ordered to some other location. Whereas you walking through the doorway, even though in some sense you're in the doorway, at that moment you're ordered to some further place by your motion. So you're ordered to the further place by the act of the motion, but you don't yet have that further place. There's still a kind of privation. What about ultimate things in natural philosophy? Natural philosophy, as we've been discussing, looks at motion. It discusses nature, the four causes, and as it progresses in the order of determination and the order of demonstration, natural philosophy takes on the character of physics or chemistry or biology. So on the one hand, the philosophy of nature ramifies into what we know as the various natural sciences. On the other hand, the philosophy of nature also approaches certain ultimate realities. The premier example of this is, of course, the first mover. Both Aristotle and St. Thomas defend arguments for the existence of God from the existence of movers and their agent causes. Right now, we should at least sketch that argument, even though each of the premises of the argument you can dive into in much greater detail. The argument basically goes like this. First of all, we experience moving things. What's in motion, a mobile in motion, cannot be the cause of its own motion. That is, whatever is in motion has to be moved by something else, distinct from itself in some way. If something is put in motion by something else, that other mover is itself either in motion or not. If it is in motion, it needs to be put in motion by some other mover. Since this sequence, since this essentially ordered interlocked series of causes can't go on to infinity, one has to arrive at a mover that is itself unmoved, a first unmoved mover. Now, like I just said, each of those two steps to draw the conclusion that whatever's in motion must be moved by another, and whatever is moved by another must be moved by a first unmoved mover, we could discuss those at great length. Instead of doing that, I just want to comment on why is this argument important in natural philosophy. First, This argument is important in natural philosophy because it provides a kind of capstone to the inquiry. The philosophy of nature investigates motion in the physical cosmos, full stop. If it's a moving thing, the philosopher of nature is interested in it. So this breadth and scope of a universal effect in the cosmos of motion has to find some resolution. What ultimately is responsible for this array of motion in the cosmos? So there's a sort of theoretic completeness that we attain if we're able to defend the soundness of that first unmoved mover argument. So if it's not a first unmoved mover, you'll have to posit at least something. For instance, a naturalist might posit that, well, ultimately, the laws of nature are responsible and give some sort of account of the laws of nature. But that would still analogously function as the theoretic capstone of the inquiry. This is what ultimately explains motion in the cosmos. A second point about that unmoved mover argument is that it doesn't tell us everything that there is to know, even philosophically speaking, much less theologically speaking, about the nature of God. So to name God as a first unmoved mover is true. It's a name that suffices to name God, but it's not a name that's sufficient in every way. So one would have to further clarify and articulate what God is like or what God is not like, and that usually requires we rely on other arguments for the existence of God to do that. So the philosophy of nature, even though it attains that type of height in proving the existence of a first unmoved mover, there's still a kind of poverty in what it attains. It's not the end of the inquiry by any means into the divine names or the divine nature. The last subject that we should discuss is the philosophy of nature as a type of wisdom. Aristotle himself says this in the Metaphysics, that the philosophy of nature is a qualified form of wisdom. What he means by this is, in comparison with first philosophy, which is philosophic wisdom, simply speaking, the philosophy of nature takes on that type of sapiential character. So this means that the philosophy of nature is both, on the one hand, a science, and on the other hand, a kind of wisdom. By science, what St. Thomas or Aristotle mean is that the philosophy of nature articulates the principles and causes of a thing. So insofar as we achieve causal explanation with certitude, the philosophy of nature takes on the character of a science. By wisdom, what Aristotle means is that the philosophy of nature directs or defends other areas of knowledge. So the philosophy of nature as wisdom tells us where to look. It gives marching orders, as it were, to the particular sciences. It's also a form of wisdom insofar as the philosophy of nature achieves something that's first or fundamental. So, for example, by proving the existence of God as the first moved mover, natural philosophy discovers a vantage point for the entirety of the cosmos. It discovers a principle that's ultimate and universal. And so that qualifies it as a kind of wisdom. In order to more fully understand this, it might help to compare and contrast natural philosophy with other parts of philosophy. This is a division that St. Thomas proposes, and it does kind of jar. It might set uneasily with how we think of different disciplines. Natural philosophy, St. Thomas explains, studies things insofar as they exist in matter and motion, and we have to define those things with matter and motion. So, for example, if I'm a chemist, remember Robert Boyle was called a natural philosopher back in the day. If I'm doing chemistry, I'm working with something that exists in matter, and in order to explain it to other people, in order to account for the causes at work, I have to define it in material terms. This contrasts with mathematics, which St. Thomas does list as part of philosophy in this older sense. Mathematics studies things that exist in matter, right? It studies shapes and sizes and numbers, but the mathematician doesn't need matter in order to define what he's studying. So, for instance, if you're proving the Pythagorean theorem, you're studying something, a triangularity, that you can find existing in material things, but you don't refer to how heavy the triangle is or how hot it is or how fast it's moving in order to prove the Pythagorean theorem. You abstract from, you prescind from those material features and just focus on more formally on the size and the shapes involved. The last part of philosophy is metaphysics or first philosophy. So unlike the philosophy of nature, metaphysics can study things not only that depend upon matter for their existence, but it also studies things that don't depend upon matter for their existence. Akin to mathematics, metaphysics therefore defines things without matter, namely the things that don't need matter in order to exist. So when St. Thomas is articulating this division, he principally has in mind things like the human soul or even angels. Those are realities. Those are substances. Substances in the case of angels that can exist without matter or any dependence upon matter. Even the human soul still exists after death, and so therefore its existence does not depend upon the existence of matter. So with these three parts of philosophy, broadly speaking, in place, we can see how natural philosophy provides a kind of completeness. Without the philosophy of nature, there wouldn't be a domain of philosophy that studies mobile and material things in their own natural environment, as it were. If you tried to replace it with mathematics, you would be missing the real physicality of what you're studying. If you tried to replace the philosophy of nature with metaphysics, that would be too broad and indirect. When St. Thomas is speaking about the philosophy of nature, he says that the philosophy of nature has a fullness of contemplation because it alone, the philosophy of nature alone, uses all the four causes as such. And that's a striking claim that Aquinas makes. One might think that, well, metaphysics studies everything. It studies being qua being. So it studies realities using all of the four causes. That's true, but only in a qualified way. Because metaphysics has such a broader scope, even when it's studying material things, it studies them insofar as they exist. Metaphysics treats of materiality indirectly, as it were. It's the philosopher of nature who most proximately and properly studies material things. In conclusion, we've seen that the philosophy of nature has a certain fullness of contemplation. It attempts to uncover the principles and causes of the whole range of the physical cosmos to understand mobile being. In doing so, it looks to the natures of things, and it traces this order of causes in the cosmos to its ultimate source. We should also reflect briefly upon how the philosophy of nature is related to theology, whether we're thinking about natural theology, something based more in philosophy, or sacred theology based in revelation. So on the one hand, philosophers such as Aristotle recognized this connection. Aristotle writes in his Parts of Animals that by studying the natural order, we slowly uncover the artistic spirit that designed natural things. The ancient commentator Simplicius exhorts us to the study of natural philosophy insofar as it can inspire awe in the Creator. This ancient and pagan recognition of the importance of the philosophy of nature in relation to divine things was incorporated and even elevated by medieval doctors like St. Bonaventure or St. Thomas. So we read that philosophy in general, but also natural philosophy in particular, is able to not only defend truths of the faith or illuminate them, but assist us in certain likenesses or helpful illustrations to understand the mysteries of the faith. He even writes in the Summa Contra Gentiles that the study of the parts of philosophy, including natural philosophy, is useful for building up the faith because through meditating on God's works, we are able somewhat to admire and consider the divine wisdom, and such a consideration leads us to admire the sublime power of God, and consequently begets in men's hearts a reverence for God, while also inflaming the souls of men to love of the divine goodness, and bestows on man a certain likeness to the divine perfection, namely through a knowledge of creatures. This means that natural philosophy is not only useful as a kind of contemplative light or even an apologetic fire, but it's useful as a form of self-knowledge. Because we are rational, embodied animals, the philosophy of nature helps us reflect on what we are. It helps us to reflect on human nature. You might think, for instance, of how the philosophy of nature, showing the distinctions between an embodied physical existence versus the pure spirituality of the human intellect, prepares us to contemplate in a theological register the reality and the promise of resurrection. The resurrection of the body, the hope for the resurrection of the body, makes sense, philosophically speaking, insofar as human nature, the human person, is incomplete without the body. Now, resurrection is not something that the philosophy of nature predicts, of course, but the philosophy of nature can help us see the coherence of that mystery and of that promise. The philosophy of nature also, in some small way, within theology, helps us to contemplate the person of Christ. Because Christ himself, in his human nature, St. Thomas writes, was human in the way that we are all human, namely by possessing a human nature. So the philosophy of nature allows us to contemplate the person of Christ, and in that small way draws us closer to a knowledge of our Creator and our Redeemer. Thank you for watching this presentation on natural philosophy and introduction. If you want more, if you want to go into greater detail in some of the arguments that we weren't able to present in this video, you can read the article in depth at ect.org.